Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you are around the world. We're so glad that you're choosing to invest an hour of your time to learn with us today. I'm thrilled to be again with my longtime friend and client, Mark Miller, as we prepare for the launch of his 11th book, Culture Rules. So as you're coming in today, we hope that you'll take a moment to let us know in the chat where you're calling in from. And in the event that you are attending this event as part of your professional development and representing your organization, we would love to know about that too. So please let us know what company or organization you represent, and we would love to give you a shout out. So hi to Mike. Hi to Lois. We've got North Carolina, Ashburn, Virginia, Indianapolis. We have someone from Untold in Kenya, Oscar in Nairobi. We've got Phoenix and Neil and Sean in Columbus. We've got Sean represents and I don't know how to say your company, Sean, Renogize Professional Coaching. I hope I said it correctly. Cassie from Waste Connections. We've got Bruce in Vero Beach. We have someone from the Peach State Academy in Watkinsville, Georgia. So it's amazing to see all of you. I've got somebody in Bogota, Colombia. Wow. So thank you so much. And we would encourage you throughout today's event to please use the chat. We want it to be a place where you can connect in community with each other. And hi to Catherine in South Carolina. Nice to see you here, Catherine. And we would also encourage you throughout today's event to put your questions in the chat, because toward the middle to end of this hour that we're going to have with Mark Miller, we'll have the chance to do some Q&A. And so we'd love to see your questions about this important topic. Now, before we get any further, I do want to also let you know about a few other considerations. We are recording this event. We will share the recording of this event through our YouTube channel later. But we also want to make sure that if you were with us for the last Culture Rules webinar, Mark's presentation is the same content as our last presentation. However, the Q&A will be all brand new based on the questions that come in today. So if you need a refresher, you want to learn again, please feel free to stay. But we also wanted to let you know that up front in case you were with us before, so that you don't sit through a repeat unless that is your intention. And we are always happy to have you with us. Anything else you want to say on that topic, Mark?
Well, yes. I mean, it'll be similar content, but I can't promise you it'll be verbatim.
Well, that would be some kind of small miracle, wouldn't it? Well, let me take a quick moment to introduce you to Mark Miller. I have not done that yet. Mark is the Vice President of High Performance Leadership at Chick-fil-A. As I mentioned, Culture Rules, his latest book, is his 11th book. I've had the pleasure of working on many of them. A few favorites are Chestnut Checkers, The Heart of Leadership, and his most recent book, Smart Leadership, which came out last spring. Mark is also a dad and a granddad. And a husband, and just an all-around great guy. And his passion is to encourage and equip leaders all over the world. And I have seen the way that he does that generously by sharing his time and energy and expertise. Another cool thing about Mark is that he was among the first corporate employees at Chick-fil-A. And he has had a career at Chick-fil-A that is spanning, I can't do the math. It's more than 40 years, right? Since 1977, Mark
Right.
has been a corporate employee of Chick-fil-A. So he has seen a lot of growth and change. And as a result, he has tons of wisdom and insight to share. So I am always happy to lean in and listen and learn from Mark. And I hope that you will all do the same today.
All right, Becky, thank you for hosting this event. And thanks all of you for being here. As Becky said, I've been selling chicken a long time. I actually started as a team member in one of our local restaurants in the 70s, and I was awful there, but decided that I wanted to make a career change and try to find something I could do better than work in the restaurant. I just wasn't good with my hands. So I went to the corporate office and I actually applied for a job in the warehouse. And much to my surprise, Truett Cathy came out and took me into his office to conduct that interview. Now, I know that may sound strange to you, but I learned that I was interviewing to be the 16th corporate employee. And when you've only got 15 team members, I'm assuming the head man or the head woman is going to conduct those interviews. And so I tell people it was a combination of God's grace and lack of discernment on Truett's part that he gave me that job. And that was a long, long time ago. I've worked all across the business, and it's just been my privilege to actually start several functions or departments, not because of any particular talent or giftedness. I think honestly, it was a little bit of let the kid do it, let the kid do it. And I would do anything. So I started our corporate communications group. I started our quality and customer satisfaction group. And honestly, I've had trouble holding down a job over the last 45 years, but it's just been a blessing and a privilege to gain a broad perspective on the business. And I think of all of that, the point that probably was pivotal that would lead me here today happened about 25 years ago. And that's when we decided that we needed to accelerate leadership development as an organization. The truth is, our process wasn't much of a process up until that point in time. It was really more of immersion and osmosis. And at a certain scope and scale, you can pull that off, right? Leaders will emerge. Leaders will make themselves known. But as we wanted to grow the business, as we wanted to tackle the problems of the day and seize the opportunities of tomorrow, we really didn't have sufficient leadership bench in order to do that. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation. It's actually it's an awful feeling, because all you can do is ignore the problem, forego the opportunity, or give it to an existing leader. And the short-term answer, and what most of us do, is we give those things to existing leaders. And that works in the moment, but that's a long-term recipe for disaster. And so about 25 years ago, our executive committee asked me to begin the journey of how do we increase our leadership capacity. Back then, we said we need more leaders, and we need them now, or we need them faster. And so that really began the last quarter of a century for me and my team trying to figure out how to help leaders within our organization and leaders around the world grow their leadership capacity. Now, Becky mentioned that I've had the opportunity to do several books. One of the questions that often comes up is, how do you decide what to write about? Well, I've already shared the overarching aim of our work, but what we do specifically is we try to look at the emerging problems that leaders are facing in our organization and around the world. And we even try to look out toward the horizon, maybe even look over the horizon and see if we could even anticipate where the world is headed. We might even be so bold as to say, where would we like the puck to go? You've heard the old thing, you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate to where it's going. Well, sometimes we try to decide what would be most helpful if we could help point leaders in a particular direction. We did that almost 15, 18, 20 years ago with the idea of leadership teams. We saw that as a great strategy to help organizations grow their leadership capacity. As strong and talented and gifted as a single leader might be, when you put 4 or 5 leaders around them, they get smarter and their leadership capacity goes up. So that's an example of us trying to address an issue that was emergent, but was not necessarily present in the moment. So with that backdrop, our team began looking a few years back, what are some of those issues? And we decided that culture was on the radar of a lot of leaders. And you could probably rationalize many, many reasons, just the complexity that leaders face, the growing volume, the scale of the enterprises we serve, and again, the macroeconomic factors and supply chain and all these other things. But we began to see those weak signals that this, although it's always been important, it's starting to emerge in conversations with leaders. I was getting more and more phone calls, texts, and emails with leaders saying something about culture. So our team decided that that would be our next endeavor. Now, keep in mind, this was pre-COVID. So COVID just exacerbated this whole situation. In fact, I would argue that COVID put pressure on the culture in your organization. It certainly put pressure on the culture in our organization. And one thing that pressure does is it exposes. it exposes strengths, and it exposes weaknesses. And some leaders, quite honestly, were very proud and thankful of the culture that emerged, that showed up under pressure. And a lot of other leaders said, wow, this is really important. So we are so thankful that we started this work years ago so that we could bring these thoughts to you today. So let me own something right up front, or at least articulate something that may be on your heart and mind. Perhaps it's why you joined this webinar today. Culture is really hard. If you feel like it's hard, you're not crazy. Culture is hard, and it's complex, and it's multifaceted, and they're independent variables, and it's just hard. So one of the things our team wanted to try and figure out is, okay, why is this hard? And there are many reasons, but let me reference a few of them. And I'll start with a story from David Foster Wallace, the late novelist, philosopher, and academic. He told the story of two young fish that were swimming along one day, and they were met by an older fish coming their way. And the old fish looked at the young fish and said, "How's the water, boys?" And the two young fish kind of looked at each other quizzically, and they kept swimming. Once they got past the old fish, one of them turned to the other one and said, "What the hell is water?" See, that's one of the problems we have with culture. We have water blindness. We are immersed in it. And sometimes it's our proximity to it. It's the fact that we live in it and we swim in it makes culture really, really, really hard to see, to understand, and even to make sense of it, because it's our reality. So that's one reason culture is hard. Another reason it's hard is it feels kind of squishy. We had one of our senior leaders just recently did a talk for our entire organization, and he challenged our folks with this idea, and I'll share it with you today. He said, it may feel squishy, but it's very strategic. Well, our team said, how do you make it less squishy? Well, one way you do that is you put a definition on it. And so we said, culture is certainly an unseen force, sort of like that water, but we know its elemental components. Culture is comprised of the cumulative effect of what people see, what people hear, what people experience, and what people believe. But that's not to make it easy. It is still difficult. It's easy because of this water blindness. It's easy because it's unseen. It's easy because there's generally a lack of consensus on what it means or what are its components. It's also challenging because every culture is unique. It defies the one-size-fits-all solutions that others may have offered for building a dynamic and thriving culture. And I'll mention just one more, that this may be the hardest to get our heads around, is culture requires leaders to always work on culture. I had a call from a CEO several months back in the middle of this work. So the timing was perfect, and he wanted to talk about culture. I said I was getting random calls from people and emails and text, and people wanted to talk about culture just out of the woodwork. So this CEO called, and he literally said, I want you to help me install a new culture. I was a little concerned. I thought his language was revealing and problematic. I said, well, I want to push back just a little bit on the word install. And he said, well, what's wrong with that word? That's what we need. Can you help us just put one in? And I said, no, it just doesn't really work that way. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm so thankful to be part of a great culture. And it's a culture that we have been working on consciously and purposefully for over 5 decades. I've been working on it for over 4 decades. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you can't stop working on it. He said, you're kidding. I mean, he literally thought you could do culture, put it in a box, check it off, and say we can move on. That's another thing that makes culture hard. So we could spend the rest of our time talking about why culture is hard. I've probably said more than enough. But then let me ask the next obvious question. Why would you work on something so hard? Well, you know the answer intuitively, experientially, you know the answer. You work on culture because culture matters. The late Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture, a healthy, thriving, dynamic, high-performance culture, drives sales, profits, customer satisfaction, execution, retention, all of it. All of it. Absolutely everything is driven by your culture. Now, you know this at some level. Well, let me say this. 72 out of 100 of you know this because we went out and did a global survey. When we said we were going to work on this, we didn't just want to share from our experience. Anytime we approach a project like this, we want to start with the pursuit of truth. What is universally true about the topic that we're about to explore? And so we talked to over 6,000 leaders, either interviewed or surveyed. Oh, well, they weren't all leaders, leaders and frontline associates, but over 6,000 people in our sample from 10 countries. And the leaders said, in the US, it was 72% of the leaders said that culture is the #1 driver of performance. Globally, it was around 67%. So 7 out of 10 of you don't need to be convinced. And so Becky mentioned the book earlier, Culture Rules. We didn't spend a lot of time in the book trying to convince folks that culture matters. We devoted part of 1 chapter to it because we think you get that. Well, here's the more troubling insight that we received from the data. In that same survey, we asked leaders to rank their priorities. One of the options was creating and maintaining culture. It ranked number 12. So let that set in for just a minute. Leaders acknowledge that culture is the primary tool at their disposal to drive performance, and yet it's number 12 on their priority list. See, that's a real problem. Because if I had to summarize our learnings from all of this work, all of the resources, all the interviews, all the study, here's my big idea, which you're probably going to take as a blinding flash of the obvious. Leaders animate culture. Left to its own, culture never drifts to a great place. By the way, individuals, teams, departments, nothing drifts to greatness. It's got to be led there. And culture is no different. So you're going to have a culture by design or by default, and you're not going to like the results if you let it happen by default. So our team was sitting there faced with this chasm. We said, we have got to help leaders align their actions with their understanding, right? We got to close the knowing doing gap. Well, how do you do that? We've already confessed this is hard. It's very complex. You know that from experience. And we were struggling. We were thinking, there's so much content. There's so much that feels relevant. What do we do with this? And so let me tell you where we got our inspiration. Some of you have studied the Navy SEALs. They're a group that we go back to pretty much for every project. We're going to learn something from the SEALs. And one of the things we learned from them that I had missed in previous studies is that part of their mantra is that there are a lot of things you got to learn to do and to know and to be as far as a SEAL goes, right? You got to swim and you got to shoot, and you got to do all that, right? But their mantra is to shoot, move, and communicate. Shoot, move, and communicate. Again, there's so much more to being a SEAL, but that's the essence of what enables them to survive to fight another day. And so we said, if the SEALs can distill all of their knowledge, skills, training, and experience down to something so succinct, maybe we can do the same thing with culture. And so we have done the work to distill all that we learned down to 3 rules. Now, some people are going to say, whoa, I've already heard this. I heard it last week. We shared this content with the entire Chick-fil-A family. We had about 9,000 folks in the room. And there were people who said, I don't like the concept of rules. And I said, okay, hold on just a minute. Before you dismiss this, hear me out. Imagine your favorite sport with no rules. I mean, think about football. You think, okay, football with no rules, is that really just rugby? Well, no. I'm talking no rules. If you have no rules, you'll have chaos. So that's the first thing you'll have. And secondly, there's nothing about that you would find engaging or productive. So I would say suspend judgment on the fact we've identified some rules, because rules identify how to play the game well. They give you the guidelines that you need to be successful. Secondly, if you violate the rules, you lose. Well, if they're rules, I'd like to know them because I don't want to lose. So stay with us. We think there are 3 rules that will help you build a high-performance culture, in essence. So let me unpack those for you really quick, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. The first rule is to aspire. Aspire. And this is about sharing your hopes and dreams for your culture. You would be amazed at how many leaders cannot articulate their hopes and dreams for their culture. We asked our Chick-fil-A family just last week, 10 days ago, what are your hopes and dreams for your culture? You need to be able to answer that. One of the case studies we did in the book was Alan Mulally, who used to be the CEO at Boeing. He worked on every airplane from the 727 to the 777, and he took over as the CEO of Ford when they were in big trouble. They were on pace to lose about $18 billion when he showed up. And he set a very clear aspiration for them. He called it One Ford. And somebody said, well, is that just a slogan? Well, it was a slogan and a lot more. It had a lot of meat behind it. They built strategies and they built tactics and they changed their mechanisms because his cultural aspiration is that they would work together. He did some very pragmatic things. He established a weekly meeting of his senior leaders, which they didn't have previously. It can be that simple that you can do the things. Once you have an aspiration, it will inform you regarding your next steps. Now, let me give you a cautionary note. In fact, I'm going to give you a couple where a lot of leaders struggle with this whole idea of aspiration is they get tripped up in the language. They get tripped up in the terminology, and they begin to ask questions about, well, mission or vision or values or purpose or ethos, like which do we need and what do they mean? Here's what all of those terms, all of those mechanisms, all of those tools have in common. They're all at your disposal to help you articulate your aspiration. You don't have to use any of them. You can use all of them. You can use some of them. You get to decide. My encouragement to you is to be really, really clear on the language you plan to use. Here's the acid test. Is your aspiration simple? Is it clear? And is it repeatable? Is it simple? Is it clear? Is it repeatable? One more cautionary note. Don't move too far down the path of certainty. I remember when I took over one of the departments, I've already confessed I've had trouble holding down a job over the years. I moved into a new role, and I remember the very first day, I'm in a big room with the whole team there, and somebody raised their hand and said, "What's the vision?" Now, I don't know if that would surprise you or not, but I would say if it's your first day or your 100th day or your 1,000th day, people expect leaders to have a vision. And so I made a comment about us having more reach and more impact, and just started down that path. And the woman who asked the question said, "That's not my question." I said, "What's your question?" She said, "I want to know who's my supervisor, are my programs going to be continued, and where am I going to sit?" And I said, I don't know the answers to any of that. That's the stuff we're going to figure out together. But let me be clear. We're going to have more reach. We're going to have more impact. We're going to have more influence. Because see, people want certainty, but they'll settle for clarity. So be very, very careful. All you can provide certainty on is intent and effort. You can be 100% sure on that. So the first rule is to aspire. The second rule is to amplify. Amplify. This is when you as the leader work to continuously amplify the aspiration. Amplify meaning to turn it up, and not necessarily just the volume, but the importance, the significance, the magnitude, the priority. It's when you convince people that you're serious about the aspiration. One of the examples from our research was Satya Nadella when he went to Microsoft. He had an aspiration that their organization move from being know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. I think that's a pretty cool aspiration. But the amplification, he did many, many things. He changed recruiting practices. He changed performance evaluations. He changed incentive compensation. Growth mindset became their primary metric, and they tied some of their senior leader compensation to that metric. So he did many, many things to amplify the aspiration. Again, to convince people he was actually serious about this. My favorite historical example that we wrote about in the book is Alexander the Great. I don't know if you're a history buff or not, but most people understand that at a very young age, Alexander embarked on a 10-year campaign in which he ultimately conquered the known world. Well, 8 years into that, in the year 326, they were approaching a battle with the Malians, which are people that inhabited the land, which is today modern day Turkey. And, he did what he always did before these battles, is he talked about courage and he talked about bravery. That was his aspiration, right? Those were the values that he was trying to inculcate into his warriors. But then he did something to amplify that still baffles me. He led from the front. He was at the front of every major battle, leading his men into harm's way. And on that particular campaign, they were about to take a citadel, and the men were putting a ladder up, and he thought they were going too slowly. So he grabbed the ladder and he went up first. He's at the top of the wall fighting with the enemy. And the men see that and they're like aghast. And so they charge the ladder. And of course, they destroy the ladder because they're all trying to go up the ladder. Alexander, looking over his shoulder, says, well, they're not going to be here for a while. So he does the only thing that makes sense to him. He jumps into the citadel, into the enemy camp, and begins fighting hand to hand by himself. So get the picture. Well, by the time his men get the ladder and get to the top, they come over, they find him up against a tree with an arrow that has pierced his lung just behind his breastplate, and he's still fighting. He's still fighting. Now, that wound almost killed him, but they won the day. They got him out of there and he survived. But here's the question. How much more did his men fight? How much stronger, how much more passion and energy did his men bring to the battle because he amplified the aspiration? It's one thing to talk about courage. It's another thing to talk about bravery. It's yet another thing to actually jump into the enemy encampment. See, people always watch the leader, which is why we have such an opportunity as we think about amplifying the aspiration through our actions. So here's my question for you. What are people learning by watching you? What are people learning by watching you? So the first rule is to aspire. The second rule is to amplify. The third rule is to adapt. It's to adapt. It's to constantly be looking for ways to enhance the culture. Now, let me say, this is a slippery slope here. And it's a trap. Because a lot of leaders, like the CEO I mentioned earlier, they want to do culture, check the box, and be done. And the reason this is so insidious is if you have a clear aspiration and you amplify it well, your culture will begin to move toward the aspiration. And leaders love to get things done. We love to check the box. We love to move on. Here's the problem. If you think you're done, you're done. Because you want to shrink wrap it. You want to protect your culture. If you shrink wrap it, you'll suffocate it. You've got to keep working on your culture if you're going to maintain relevance and vitality. Now, I was asked just recently, well, what kind of enhancements are you talking about? Real quick, I'll say 3 categories. Think about it like this. One is closing critical gaps. Well, what's a critical gap? Critical gaps are patterns of unhealthy and unproductive behavior. If you see those, whether it's apathy, unhealthy competition, any other signs of low levels of engagement, loss of procedural discipline, those should be warning signs for you that there's something wrong. Those are toxins that you need to address. The second type of enhancement are those that you might think of as leveraging your strengths. So think about something. Let's assume there are no toxins at any levels that are of a concern. So you say, what are our strengths? If you double down on your strengths and get much better at something, you've just enhanced your culture. So one form of enhancement, address a toxin. Second is to leverage a strength. And the third is to add additional capabilities. And sometimes we don't think about this. Dan Cathy, our former CEO, did this about 15 years ago. He said he wanted our culture to be more innovative. Now, it's not that we didn't have any innovators. Truett Cathy was the original innovator because he invented the chicken sandwich. But Dan said, I think we need more innovation across the board. That was his aspiration. And we began to do things to make that a reality. We began to adapt. And I would argue today, the culture is much more innovative than it was 15 years ago. One fun example, some of you know the New Zealand All Black rugby team. I think to this day, they're probably still the most successful professional sports franchise in the history of the world. Between 1903 and 2004, they won about 80% of their matches. But in 2004, they fell on hard times. And the men themselves would tell you that they had failed to adapt. And they went on a mission of trying to reinvent their culture. They had toxins that they had to address. And so there's a fascinating book out there called Legacy by James Kerr that I recommend. And they were able to find their winning ways again. Between 2012 and 2016, was that 5 years? They only lost 2 matches in 5 years as a professional sports team that plays on a global scale. Fascinating. You can adapt. Now, Cautionary Tale, I read an article last week that the All Blacks are struggling again, which would be the second time in almost 120 years they've been struggling. And guess what they're trying to do now? They're trying to figure out how to adapt. My encouragement to you is don't wait until you're struggling. Constantly and continuously be looking for ways to enhance your culture. One fun story about that, and we'll move on. I'm asked, these are just questions I've had early on. Maybe some of these will even show up in the chat. Somebody said, well, how do you tell if you've got toxins? That's the one. Most people understand leveraging your strengths and even the adding new capabilities, but caution, yellow flag for a lot of leaders when you start thinking about toxins, probably because you've seen some and you've encountered some. People say, well, how do you figure that out? Well, my short answer is you need an early warning system. If you're going to adapt well, you must listen well. And typically, early warning systems take some shape or form of listening, some way to assess the health and the vitality of your culture. One example that most people know about is what the coal miners did about 100 years ago. They would actually carry a canary with them into the coal mine. And the concept was relatively straightforward. The birds were so sensitive to the toxins that they would stop singing, maybe even fall out before the toxins reached a level that they would harm the men. And so when the men saw the bird, either, again, woozy or falling out, they would evacuate. Saved a lot of lives. But the rest of the story that very few people know about is the extraordinary lengths that the miners went to save the birds. They actually invented something called a revival cage. And they have glass sides and a little glass door that you can close and an oxygen tank on top. And so what would happen if the bird fell ill, they would seal the chamber and they would turn the valve to flood the cage with oxygen. I love that because that's a perfect metaphor for what you and I have the opportunity to do as leaders. When we sense toxins in our organization, we control the valve. We have the opportunity to put pure oxygen into our organizations and purge the toxins. And when we do, everybody wins. All right, Becky, I'm going to stop at that point and I'm going to say, let's take some questions. Can we do that?
We sure can. And I have a few coming in. We're going to start with this one from Carrie. Carrie's wondering, Mark, where you begin the process of evaluating an organization's current culture and then bringing change to it.
Okay. Obviously, there's a lot of context that matters, Carrie. So please forgive me. I love Q&A, and then I don't like Q&A because I want to be careful. I never give 10-cent answers to million-dollar questions. So give me a little grace here. I would say, look at a couple things. One, look at the behaviors of the people. Are they doing what you want them to do? And are they doing it with the right attitude, with the right spirit? Is their work giving them joy? Is the work fulfilling? Is the work gratifying? If you see trouble there, that could be an indicator that there's some cultural issues going on. In the book, we actually list a more detailed list of toxins that you can be on the lookout for, but I think you can make your own list. I asked a group not long ago, how can you tell if a culture is not healthy? And in about 60 seconds, they gave me about 30 ideas. I mean, it was like, well, people don't show up and people don't care and people fight with each other and, withhold information. So those are the kind of first start with behaviors. The other thing is, do you have any metrics? You may not have thought about it this way, but performance metrics are really a reflection of the behavior of people. And so I mentioned one of my examples is the loss of procedural discipline or the deterioration of procedural discipline. Is the organization executing? Are you getting more customer complaints than you've had historically? Are you having more returns, more defects, more errors? That's a culture problem. That's a culture problem. Another metric you can look at is, do you do an engagement survey? I don't think engagement is necessarily the end-all, be-all measure of culture that some people do. Again, I write about that in the book. I think it's got its place. I think engagement matters. I think you probably want more than engagement, but if you've got low engagement, that's a culture problem. So look at behaviors and then do a deep dive in the metrics and look one level behind the numbers, and you'll probably figure out if you've got some toxins at play.
Thank you, Mark. So we have a question from Matt. What are some canaries outside the mine? So he said the first level of toxicity doesn't kill the bird. What is the threshold for toxicity in a business organization?
Yeah, I'm afraid that would be totally situational. I would say different toxins have different levels of toxicity, if that's a word. So a toxin would be, hardiness would be a toxin. Well, it might be a while before that one would kill you, but hoarding information or lying or backstabbing or those are different toxins. So I think part of it is which toxins in which combinations, and are they isolated or are they pervasive? Now they do tend to spread, right? If word gets out that nobody cares if you're on time, it may start in one team and it goes to another team and another team and another team. Maybe at some point that could even kill you, right? If you're not showing up now for client things or for customer things, and you lose your sense of urgency or timeliness. But they have different impact in different combinations and in different contexts. The bottom line is when you sense them, again, patterns of unhealthy and unproductive behavior, you gotta turn the valve. You have to intervene because you don't want them to become an epidemic.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have more questions coming in, but I forgot that before we went to the questions, I was supposed to talk about some ways that people can continue to learn from the book Culture Rules.
Sorry.
And I do.
Yeah, I sent it to questions. My apologies.
Well, it's all right. We're going to get back on track. So we want to make sure that no one misses the fact that if you pre-order Mark's book, there are tons of amazing bonuses. And what I want to highlight right now is that if you order only 11 books, Mark will do a private 60-minute virtual event with your team. We're going to send you to leadeveryday.com to find out more. But the other thing I want you to know is if your organization purchases 500 books, Mark will come at no cost to you and do an in-person keynote, which is amazing. I have seen Mark give a keynote in person before, and the value of that hour is immense. So we wanted to make sure that you knew about that. So please visit leadeveryday.com to learn more about these bonuses. You get bonuses whether you order one book or whether you order, 1,000 books. We also want to make sure that you're aware that we have one more webinar in this series. It will be, again, a presentation on culture rules like we had today with open Q&A. And then on Mark's launch day, we will be having a virtual launch celebration. We'll be face-to-face with Mark. We would love to have you be a part of that. And we have a very special guest host, Harris III. So please just stay tuned for all of that. And I believe Wendy is putting all of those links in the chat for you. So now we will get back to our questions that have been coming in. And we were previously talking about toxicity, and Elizabeth had a question about what it means to flood the organization with oxygen. So what are some examples of what it might look like to flood an organization with oxygen and revive the culture?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Great question. There are any number of strategies that you can use depending on the circumstances. So in the book, I think, gosh, I should remember this. I think we have 7 different strategies in the book. We call them countermeasures. And so let me give you a couple of examples because, again, they're situational, right? This is a hard topic, which we kept saying, how do we simplify it without becoming simplistic? So there is a chapter on 7 or 8 or 9 toxins, and there's a chapter on what happens if you allow those toxins to metastasize. They become maladies. And then there's a chapter on 7 or 8 countermeasures. Let me give you a couple of examples. One we call rip the Band-Aid. And this is when a leader has to make drastic change in a short period of time. The consequences are so dire that the leader must intervene. The example we use in that is what President Reagan did after the space shuttle disaster. He shut down NASA and changed the culture of NASA forever. Now, we talk about that in the book. You could argue that was a successful countermeasure. There are consequences. And many people would tell you that NASA has never been the same, right? They're safer, but they're more bureaucratic, which, again, we can debate the pros and cons of all that. But the point is, that is one way that a leader can intervene. Let's take it all the way to the other end. We profile Google in an example we call Take It Off Broadway. And this is about running experiments. And this is not on stage in the spotlight. That's where we got the off-Broadway idea. They are famous for doing small experiments in order to enhance their culture. and they try stuff and it works, they scale it. And if it doesn't work, they try something else. They've done this even with the letters, the emails, memos they send out to encourage people to participate in their 401k, because they have looked at the data, and it's kind of like widely known that the earlier you start in life, it's math at this point. The earlier you start, the more money you're going to have at retirement. And they said that a lot of their people weren't participating. And so they began writing different types of emails and measuring the response so that they could encourage more people to participate, because they said, we actually believe the data indicates it's in their best interest if they'll do this. So that's a different way to adapt. That's a different way to enhance a culture through small experiments. And we've got several other examples there, but it's, if I could summarize it, I would say any positive intervention on the part of the leader breathes oxygen into the organization. It may be as simple as getting rid of a toxic employee, and you'll breathe new life, right? Leaders animate culture. And the word animate means bring to life. And when you take those things out that are stealing life from the organization, when you deal with those, you help everybody.
Thank you, Mark. So Daryl, who's been a longtime supporter of your book launches, has a difficult question, and I'm going to try it.
I love difficult questions. Okay, here we go.
Yeah. So Daryl says, I worked at an organization that didn't have one CEO, but several, when you considered the elected department directors with other executives reporting to governing bodies, but all under the umbrella of the county. So as a result, there were not only several cultures, but there were subcultures within the cultures. And so his question is, how do you work with and create one culture in that kind of system or structure?
Okay, Daryl, I want to be real careful here. I'm not trying to minimize your question. It's a great question, but here's the deal. There's never one culture. There's never one culture. What you have, we've chosen the language of microcultures. Let's take it out of your setting for just a minute, because I don't know all your circumstances. Let's take Chick-fil-A as an example. Chick-fil-A corporate. There's a different culture in accounting than there is in marketing, than there is in operations, than there is in product R&D. Now, you can say, well, it's different work. Well, it's different work, but it's different leaders who bring a different bias and a different perspective. And so I'm in the camp that microcultures always exist. The trick is not to let them become countercultures. A counterculture is working against the overall aspiration of the enterprise. Whereas microcultures have their own uniqueness, but they are contributing to the larger whole. And so if you don't have agreement at the highest level, yes, it gets really difficult. And I want to honor that. I think that's what I'm hearing behind your question, but don't assume that every department, division, and team will have the mirror image culture of the enterprise. They will have supporting microcultures.
Man, that is such a smart response.
Hope it helps. Hope it helps.
I see a thank you from Daryl in the chat. Here's a question from Brooke. How do senior leaders work to change toxic cultures when the executive leader is not addressing it?
Yeah, it gets really hard. It gets really hard. And I don't want to give you a simplistic response. Here's something for you to consider. It may or may not be helpful. People ask me all the time how to be successful. And I'm not saying that's your question, but just people ask, I get that question all the time. Often it's a text message from like, hey, give me some advice. I want to be successful. And I say, with 95% consistency, help your boss be wildly successful. Help your boss be wildly successful. So I have in my career gone to my boss or my boss's boss and tried to help them see their blind spots. You can decide to do that or not. I'm not saying you have to, but I think I would want to believe if they know your heart, they'll hear you. They may disagree with you. I got one story. I had mentioned something several times to my boss. Okay, probably 5 or 6 times, because I just felt like he was missing it. And I think being a truth teller is at least part of my adopted role, whether anybody told me I needed to do that or not. And about the 5th or 6th time I brought this up, he said, I don't ever want you to mention that again. And I never did. I felt like I had done my part, right? At that, I mean, here's one more thing to think about. Again, and you don't have to agree with this. This is my worldview. There is something more important than being right, and it's submission to authority. If you're not being asked to do something that is illegal, unethical, or immoral by someone that you work for, it's on them. Now, for me, I feel like I need to voice my opposition or my point of view or my alternative to feel like I've done my job. But if I choose to stay in the role, I have chosen to stay under authority, and I will not be accountable for that outcome. So that's the way I look at it. I hope something in there would serve you.
Thank you, Mark. So we have kind of a comment/question from John. So he's wondering, do leaders perhaps struggle to prioritize actually working on culture because the mindset is still all about performance and not about valuing people? In other words, since culture doesn't have a clear, quick, and measurable effect on performance, it doesn't get worked on because it's always something we'll get around to.
Okay. There's a lot in that question. I'm watching our clock here. I would argue the leaders who have the best sustained performance are the ones who work on culture. Culture is what enables, again, culture is not the goal. I'm not sure I said that earlier. I run into leaders all the time. I had a leader one time tell me they had a great culture, and I was excited. I said, "That's thanks for sharing." This was before we did this work on culture. Like, this leader was just proud. And then they said, "There's only one problem." And I had no idea what they were going to say next. And this woman said, "Our performance is awful." And I said, "Well, you lost the plot. You lost the storyline. You have deceived yourself to think that culture is the goal. Culture is an enabler." I said, "You need to take this great culture and go back to your people and say, guess what we're going to do with this great culture? We're going to produce some results," right? So yeah, it's an enabler. And I think leaders who don't want to work on it, my bet, and the reason we wrote this book is many leaders, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, they don't actually know what to do to work on culture, right? It starts with, I don't know what it is, and I don't know what to do. Because if you ask somebody, what are the drivers of culture, they can make you a list of 50 or 60 things. And that's, sure you can, I can, you can. That's not productive. What are the irreducible minimum activities that a leader needs to do? And when you say it's 3 things, state an aspiration, amplify that aspiration, and look for ways to enhance your culture. I've already met a bunch of leaders. I mean, the book's not even out yet, and I've met leaders going, "Okay, I got it. I got it. Now I can put action on it. I can put time on it." You can actually look at your calendar, looking back 30, 60, 90 days, and see how much time you spent on these types of activities. And last thought, this is a bit of a tangent, just naming it as something as simple as aspire, amplify, and adapt, it raises consciousness. It raises awareness. I tell the story in the book of a leader who was so proud, and I was proud for him. He and his leadership team had worked really, really hard to refresh their values. And they had done good work. They had hired a consultant. They spent a lot of time. They interviewed a lot of people. I mean, they had done it well, and they'd come up with some values that I wanted to join their organization. I mean, who wouldn't want to be part of that? And then near the end of our interview, He said, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut our interview just a little bit short because I'm going to go do orientation for our new employees. And I said, fantastic. This is the CEO. Of course, that's great. The CEO is going to do orientation with new employees. I said, I guess you're going to tell them about the values. He looked at me and said, thought never crossed my mind. He said, maybe I should do that. So a leader who wants to work on performance, it's not that hard to work on culture if you can make it top of mind and you can make it actionable.
Wow. Well, that's super helpful. And we are coming near the end of our hour, but I hope everyone will stick around because we have a new approach to capturing your key learnings from today's event. But before we do that, I want to go back to our commercial one more time and remind you that there are some great ways for you to continue learning from this book, Culture Rules, by pre-ordering it for yourself and your team today to be able to access these amazing bonuses, including a 60-minute virtual private event with Mark if you order 11 books and an in-person keynote if you order 500 plus books. Please visit leadeveryday.com to find out more about that. And what I'd like to do now is we want to invite you to participate in a Mentee. This is something new that we've been doing within Zoom. You're going to have the chance to give us your key takeaways from today's event. And it will just take me a minute to bring that up. Looks like. If you can bear with me, I'm going to pass it to Mark to share some parting thoughts. And while he's sharing those, I'm going to bring that up and we're going to take your feedback about today's event. So Mark, it's to you.
Great. Well, when we said we were going to do this webinar, I decided I wanted to close with a short story. It's the story that I included in the epilogue of the book. Some of you have seen the movie Ready Player One, which is the Steven Spielberg adaptation of Ernest Cline's novel by the same name. For those that have not, let me give you a quick lay of the land. I won't reveal any secrets from the story, but the story is fascinating. It's a story told in two realities. Part of the story takes place in the real world, and the other part of the story takes place in a virtual world. They call it the Oasis. And Wade Watts is the hero of the story. In the virtual world, he's assumed the name and persona of Parzival, the mythic knight of the Round Table who was in search of the Holy Grail. And Wade is looking for the keys in the Oasis that will unleash wealth and prosperity so that he might have a better life in the real world. It's a great, great story. I highly recommend it. So the line in that book that I want to leave you with is Wade talking about the two realities, but more specifically is why he would want to move even momentarily from the real world to the virtual world. And he said, people go to the Oasis for what they can do there, and they stay because of who they can become. And I want to encourage you maybe to even lift your sights as you think about your culture, as you think about that aspiration. What would happen if you created an organization that was so attractive, people would want to go there because of what they could do. They would want to go there for a job, but they might just stay because of who they can become. That's been my story at Chick-fil-A now for 45 years. I went because of what I could do, and I stayed because of who I might become. That would be my hope for you as you try to build a thriving, dynamic, vibrant, high-performance culture. I wish you the best.